organized and fixed up. And welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Our webinar is Connecting the PsychEd Assessment to the Individual Education Plan with a focus on students with severe learning disabilities. We know this has been a challenging time in education, and we're all stretched and worked like never before. So we want to thank you all for taking the time to come today and hope that you find the information that we're about to discuss helpful. The webinar is being recorded, so you don't need to worry about taking notes, and will be emailed to you along with the slide deck following the webinar. Please go ahead and share this information freely and widely with your colleagues. My name is Shannon Scullion. I'm one of 3 resource staff at Trillium Demonstration School. I'm an Ontario certified teacher, and I'm seconded from Halton District School Board. My current role at Trillium School is to support educators and school boards across Ontario who are seeking support for their students with severe learning disabilities and ADHD. I have just over 20 years of experience in special education. As a teacher, I've worked in several roles, including CERT, Teacher of Self-Contained Programs for Behavior and Mental Health, a seconded teacher to Trillium School. I've also worked for 10 years as a psychoeducational consultant with 2 Ontario school boards. I'm joining you today with 2 of my colleagues from Trillium Provincial School Resource Services Department, Wendy Farkas, who's seconded from Waterloo District School Board, and Fleur Lay, who's seconded from Halton District School Board. Please make sure you check out their webinars, which are coming up soon. Wendy and Fleur, if you can please say a quick hello.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here today. If you have any questions, feel free to add them to the chat, and I'm going to help mediate discussion later on.
And it looks like Fleur's maybe not logged on yet, so hopefully she'll be joining us when she comes to find the time to do that. This morning, we've all been pulled away from our jobs to help out around the school, so it's a little bit crazy here as it is in all schools today. So today's webinar's, in today's webinar, here's our schedule, is focusing on students with learning disabilities and 2 key components or documents that we use to support them on their educational journey. We've got the PsychEd Assessment and the Individual Education Plan. First, we're going to take a look at the PsychEd Assessment and discuss what is found in these reports, how the data is communicated, and what the various components of the report mean for students with severe learning disabilities. The second half of the presentation will focus on the IEP and the key parts of the IEP where data and information from the PsychEd can be brought to life for students with severe learning disabilities. With respect to questions, as Wendy has mentioned, please just type those in the chat room and she'll try to monitor that as we go along. And there is a section in between the 2 components of the presentation where we'll stop and try to answer questions if we can. A PsychEd assessment, so we'll look firstly at the PsychEd assessment. A PsychEd assessment generally and consistently, when you pick up any PsychEd assessment, will have the same components within the PsychEd. So for the most part, the components are presented in the same order in a PsychEd. However, depending on a number of variables, such as the examiner's style, the setting the report's written in, for example, a clinical versus educational setting, or the diagnoses that are being explored, for example, a PsychEd exploring autism or mental health might look slightly different than a setup for a PsychEd for an LD student. I've included a sample, so these are the sections that you'll generally see in all PsychEd assessments. And what we're going to do now is just quickly walk through an assessment and the different parts that you'll see. So all of these parts you will see in a PsychEd assessment. So on the front page, they'll generally, they'll generally be the reason why the student was assessed. And in school boards, the reason is particularly around educational programming and to gather more information to support the students in our schools. The examiner will always list the sources of information. So these will include all the assessment tools that were administered. We're going to talk a little bit more about those in upcoming slides. There's always, in every PsychEd, background information provided. Some go into more detail than others, but generally in the background information, there's a historical component where we go right back to a student's birth history and talk about so their early development, language development, milestones. There'll be information around school, health, family. So all of that is included in the background. All psych ed reports have a behavior observation section, and in this section, basically what is described is how the student behaved in the standardized setting. So was the student focused, processing instructions? How were they in that optimal quiet one-to-one setting? Were they feeling stressed, or was there difficulties with behavior? Within this section, you'll always see a statement near the end that tells you whether or not the results of the report can be considered reliable and valid based on the student's behavior in the assessment. So you always want to hopefully achieve an assessment where those results are reliable and valid. Otherwise, sometimes you have to interpret the results with caution. Every PsychEd assessment will, of course, have a section where there's information on the assessment. So all the assessment data, particularly for an LD student. So there will be a little description of how the scores are reported. So in terms of percentiles in this particular report, and that's described here. Sometimes that information is included in an addendum to the report as well. In terms of the assessment results, there's always a piece on the cognitive profile of a student. So here we have a chart describing the subtests, or sorry, the index scores from the WISC-5, which is an IQ test. So there'll always be some sort of IQ measure, and that will be described in the report. Then there will be some processing areas described. We're going to talk more about that in an upcoming slide. So those areas will also be described in the PsychEd. And of course, the academic profile. And generally, you'll see a section on reading, writing, and math. The last section of the IEP looks, and this can be called a number of things, will be called attention profile or social emotional skills. And it's an assessment of it could be anything looking at ADHD to looking at anxiety. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that looks like for a student being assessed for an LD. Finally, all PsychEd assessments end with a formulation or a summary, which often includes, and here it's bolded, a statement, a diagnostic statement. So if there is a diagnosis to be made, this is where you'll generally find that diagnosis. So if you're looking for it for an IEP, you can search for that right in the summary of the report. A lot of PsychEd reports will include a list of strengths and needs, which is of course very helpful when you're writing the IEP. We'll be talking more about that as well in the presentation. And lastly, all PsychEd reports end with a list of recommendations. Okay, and I'm just going to end this. All right, so if we return now to our slide deck. So basically, as mentioned, all of these areas are in every PsychEd report. So hopefully, if you pick up a PsychEd report for one of your students, you'll be able to notice those areas within the psych. So just to go into a little bit more detail about sort of the assessment tools. So what kinds of assessments will you typically see administered for an LD assessment? In terms of anecdotal data, when an examiner is querying an LD, collecting data that's both historical as well as from across environments, home and school, is necessary, as you want to be able to demonstrate that challenges have been present for a while and are not simply the result of recent variables in the child's life, such as stress or illness. So generally, classroom observation is not typical, but we see that this examiner did do classroom observation. So that would red flag for someone looking at this, that perhaps the examiner was querying something around behavior or ADHD and maybe trying to get in the classroom to have a look at that. For a student who's being assessed for an LD, you'll always see cognitive and academic pieces within the PsychEd, the two biggest components. So here we have the Wechsler tests. They're the sort of gold standard tests that are used in the assessment industry. So there's the Wechsler intelligence test, and then its sister test, the academic scale. Then these are other, the Woodcock, the Kaufman, there's also the Stanford-Binet. There are various different, there's various cognitive and academic skills that can be used depending on what board you're with or where you're seeing the assessment come from. There's always, for students that are being assessed for learning disabilities, a section that looks at processing skills. These are just a few of some of the most common processing assessment tools that you'll see used. So they look at memory, phonological processing, executive functioning. So those are just a few examples of things that you might commonly see. In terms of that last section of the PsychEd assessment, the examiner here might be looking at attention, might be looking at ADHD. Right here, it's got an inventory for anxiety, so a questionnaire around anxiety. So this would cue you to the fact that the examiner is looking at something else in terms of a comorbid assessment for this student. So you've likely heard the term comorbid, which means the presence of more than one disorder, which is statistically very prevalent for LD students. Most common with learning disabilities are ADHD and anxiety. So you can see in this particular example that the examiner was querying both attention and anxiety. Okay, so now if we move into the PsychEd assessment and the data. So as teachers and educators, the data we work with is mostly criterion referenced, which compares what a student knows against concise written descriptions of what is expected at specific grades or stages in their education. When looking at a PsychEd assessment, you want to look more through a clinical lens, as the data is all norm referenced, meaning scores are compared to thousands of other students who are part of a normative sample. The beauty and also confusing caveat to standardized tests is that there are a variety of clinical scores that can be generated. However, when digging through the report to support a student with an LD, this is some of the stuff that you can focus on and bring to light in your IEP. So descriptive ranges are important, and these are simply a grouping of percentile scores. So a descriptive range of average means your percentile score is between the 25th and the 74th percentile. These are what the ministry requires us to use in terms of assessment data on the IEP, which we'll talk a little bit more about. A percentile rank is the most common way you will see data described in a PsychEd. Percentile scores range from less than the first to the 99th percentile, and it describes the positions of a student's score in relation to their same age peers. For example, a student that scored, let's say, at the 30th percentile on a particular task means that he scores equal or greater than 30% of his same age peers, but that 70% of those same age peers are performing better than him on that particular task or measure. A standard score, again, is another score that describes a position, a student's position on in relation to their same age peers. Okay, it's often, standard scores are often used by examiners to compare scores across different assessment tools. Sometimes you will see a lot of age equivalencies in PsychEd reports. And this means the student here is demonstrating knowledge similar to peers that are 7 years and 7 months of age. A grade equivalency score is not something you typically see a lot in a PsychEd, but basically a grade equivalency of 7.7 means the student is demonstrating a knowledge skill set on a particular measure or task similar to students in the 7th month of grade 7. The months can go up to 10, given that there are 10 months in a school year. Please note that grade equivalent scores on psychometric measures do not correlate directly to the Ontario curriculum expectations, so therefore use these cautiously if you see them. Okay, you'll also, of course, see IQ and standard deviation scores reported in PsychEd assessments. Okay, So when you're looking at a PsychEd assessment for a student with a learning disability, you can see a variation of things in terms of a diagnosis and an identification. So you might see it called a learning disorder, a diagnosis of a learning disorder impacting math, for example, with a code. You might see written in the PsychEd that they meet identification criteria, or they meet diagnostic criteria for a learning disability. One of the most important things you can do in working with students with a learning disability is understand the identification criteria for the exceptionality, communications, learning disability for your board. Although the ministry provides the areas of exceptionalities, it is left up to individual boards to define the criteria for each exceptionality. Most boards adhere to PPM8 and the ministry document, which we'll talk about in a little bit, which are both actually linked here as well. But this is not a must. No matter how you see it written in the report, if you're not sure whether or not a student meets your board criteria or you don't understand the diagnosis, just ask. So here, right here, all of these three align quite nicely. So the PPM8 aligns with the ministry education for the definition of a learning disability. The DSM-5 is where things, the way that they write it in reports, it can be a bit confusing and misleading, especially when compared to identification criteria. So it's important, as I mentioned, that you understand the criteria for your board identification of an LD, and that you work with your certs or your system level consultants if you're confused. Here is just a definition of a learning disability. So this is based on the PPM8 and the ministry document. So the most common definition that is used by practitioners administering PsychEd assessment. So they're looking for sort of broad average to average intellectual ability. Achievement or academic scores are inconsistent with the intellectual abilities in the areas of reading, writing, math, or work habits and learning skills. They're looking at phonological processes and weaknesses, usually in two areas. They're looking for exclusions, so we can't have a student that's performing well below grade expectations with average cognitive ability and the results being reflected of hearing or vision impairment. So that we have to sort of be free of these challenges, because these things in terms of trauma and mental health can really depress scores, and you can't get an accurate reflection of things that are discrepant when those things are present. So you want to make sure that none of these are present, and they're called exclusions. And there needs to be some sort of historical fact that there's been a significant impact on academic functioning. All right. So the biggest component of a PsychEd is, of course, the cognitive or ability measure when we're looking at a profile for a learning disability. The WISC-5, which is the main IQ test used by most PsychEd consultants, has three big sort of main components. Firstly, we have the verbal comprehension index. And these are the things that it looks at and it measures. We have the visual spatial index, and these are the things that are measured here, and the fluid reasoning. So these two are actually visually based scores that look at a child's thinking, reasoning, problem solving, all done with visual things. And then we look here at a child's thinking, reasoning, problem solving, and understanding, all done verbally. The IQ test, the WISC-5, also has working memory and processing speeds skills, and these are sort of proficiency areas that help out these main three areas. So you'll see these scores reported often in a PsychEd assessment. Another nice score you might see is the cognitive proficiency index, which is a combination of both the working memory and the processing speed index. And it gives you a nice measure of how these two indexes work together to help a child function to their best ability in terms of their verbal and visual reasoning skills. So what will you see if you have a child that has weaknesses in that verbal area? So in the classroom, this student might struggle to understand new lessons. They might struggle to follow oral instructions and questions. Problem solving with language would be very challenging for a student with weak verbal skills. Expressing their understanding and thinking, especially verbally and in writing. Integrating verbal information would be difficult. Working with and understanding abstract and novel concepts that are verbal. So for example, making an inference when you're reading or asking why questions when you're reading. So those are some of the ways that you might see that impact in the classroom with low verbal scores. I'm just going to highlight if a student has weak visual or fluid reasoning scores, what you might see in the classroom. Typically, students would struggle with any tasks that are visual and involve procedural learning, trial and error problem solving, understanding anything that's visual, such as charts and diagrams and maps, working with construction paper projects or poster board presentations, or even like visual things such as slides, understanding the concept of quantity, generalizing, math concepts and strands would be challenging, such as graphing, geometry, patterning, directionality. So those are just some of the difficulties that you would see with students that have weaknesses in this area. Generally, the profile of student that we see at Trillium Provincial Demonstration School is a strength in these visual areas and an overall weakness with these verbal areas. So a key, I'd like to draw your attention to the first to an important document. Sorry, back up a bit. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about processing weaknesses. So this is a key thing to understand in terms of programming for an LD student. I'm going to draw your attention to this document here, which is a real big go-to for those of us at Trillium, and I've used it a lot in my teaching and assessment. So this document was put together by York Region. It's widely available on the internet just by doing a Google search. It's also connected here in this slideshow. But basically it's organized by processing area. So if we look in it, it does a brilliant job of defining each of the processing areas. So there's phonological processing, gives a nice definition. There's signs that you would see for a student that's struggling with processing, phonological processing. And then right here, and this is information that you'll use directly in your IEP, are instructional strategies, environmental strategies, and assessment strategies. So it does a really nice job of doing the work of your IEP for you, in that it includes various strategies that would benefit a student with those particular processing weaknesses. This is a similar document to the one above, again, published by York Board. It's just 2 pages, and I really like this one because it's really quick and easy to look at, but you can see all of the processing areas here, and it reads down. So there's your definition of phonological processing, what you might see in for a student in the classroom, and then your instruction, environmental, and assessment strategies, which you can pull and use directly on the IEP. So I also included in this slide a few of the assessment tools that you might see in a PsychEd assessment if the examiner is looking at these areas. So if an examiner is suspecting a deficit in phonological awareness skills, they would likely use this assessment tool, and you would see it listed as we went through on the front page of that assessment, or of the PsychEd assessment, and then it would be described in the assessment section of the PsychEd. These are some of the big memory tools that are used, as well as visual motor, attention, and executive functioning. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list, but just some of the most popular assessment tools that you'll see in PsychEd assessments. A big key to programming for a student with a learning disability is understanding their processing weaknesses. so that you can use appropriate strategies, accommodations, and remedial approaches to address those weaknesses, because these really are the underlying weaknesses that are causing them to struggle academically in reading, writing, or math. So this is sort of, we've reached sort of the end of the PsychEd assessment report, and now need to look for key information at the end of that PsychEd assessment report. So we're looking for key information to put into the IEP. So generally, I've included an example of a diagnostic statement that you would find in a PsychEd report. If you're lucky, you'll have a nice list of strengths and needs in your PsychEd report that directly relate to the cognitive and academic assessments administered in the report. So you can pull these out and hopefully put them right into the strengths and needs section of your IEP. So recommendations, they can be overwhelming sometimes because there's pages of them at times. So there's just a few sort of suggestions here. So often following a PsychEd assessment, if you're a cert in the school, you'll often be left with a lot of sort of next steps and follow-ups. So you might need to, for example, connect the student to the child and youth care worker in your school to work on some social emotional needs. Maybe there's recommendations around discussion for placement and identification through an IPRC. Maybe there's recommendations around SIA equipment and prescribed technology that you need to process. It's always a good idea to update that IEP following any kind of PsychEd assessment to include the latest data. So those are some of the things that you might have to work on right away. Aside from that, I would suggest prioritizing behavior and social emotional needs, because you want to make sure that the child is available as a learner. And if we all know that if they're struggling emotionally and if there is behaviors, you want to figure out what's underneath that, the anxiety or mental health issues, so that you can address those and make the student as available for learning as they can be. And then literacy and numeracy should always be kept as a priority when you're looking at the recommendations. And so that's sort of where you'll end up at the end of a PsychEd report. I'm just going to pause here, and Wendy, I'm not sure how the chat is looking in terms of questions, or if I can keep moving through.
There aren't any questions right now. If anyone has any questions for Shannon, please do type them in either the Q&A or the chat room. If you click on the bottom of your screen, you should see a little pop-up for Q&A and chat.
Okay, so I'll just keep going, just in interest of time. So in the final section of our presentation today, we're going to talk about connecting the data from the PsychEd right to the IEP. So we're going to look at the following areas of the IEP and connecting the data to these areas. So we're going to look at the assessment area of the IEP, the strength and needs area, the accommodation area, and then learning expectations around modified programming and the teaching strategies and assessment methods that we can pull from the PsychEd to connect to that. Okay, so on the first page of the IEP, you'll always have the assessment data section. And here you'll need to connect the diagnostic data from the PsychEd if you've had a student that was assessed and diagnosed with a learning disability. So here is a chart. The ministry document states that we have to include the information source, so the person that administered the assessment, the date the assessment was done, and the summary of the results. Please keep in mind that each board has their own system for writing IEPs, so I caution you to know your board, search your internal website for IEP writing guides, and ask your CERT or system level spec ed personnel if you have any questions. The ministry states a list of sort of things that are good to include here and things that they don't want you to include. So some of the things that they talk about including are information. They basically say that information should be directly related to the reasons why the student has an IEP. So in these results, you want to see sort of a painted picture of like, why does this child actually need this IEP? So in this case, we have a diagnosis of a learning disability, as well as a physician who has diagnosed ADHD. So we can see, based on the assessment data, the exact needs for why there is an IEP. The ministry document talks about possible places where you might gather this data from. So from educational assessments, speech and language assessments, you can include occupational and physical therapy assessment results here, behavior assessments. So there's a whole list in the ministry document about what types of assessments are appropriate to include. You never just want to write see the OSR. We know that all the information is there, but you do need to capture and bring to life the students' assessment data. And the ministry also does a nice job in their document of providing sort of some summary statements of different types of assessments and what would be appropriate to include. In terms of things that are not appropriate to include, you don't want to include like every assessment that the student has done historically. You want to capture the student here and now. The IEP is a living document. You want to show the most recent assessments and the ones that capture that student's current learning strengths and needs. Do not ever include, and I've put an arrow here, percentile scores. You want to include descriptive ranges rather than percentile scores. Medical diagnoses that do not, like we do have a medical diagnosis included here, but those that do not relate directly to the reason that we're having this IEP for the student should not be included. So like, for example, if you have a student who you're writing an IEP for around needs related to a hearing impairment and an identification of a hearing impairment, you may not want to include medical diagnosis if the student, for example, has been diagnosed with diabetes, because that wouldn't be relevant to their programming around their hearing impairment. So as long as the medical piece is related to the student's strengths and needs, it can be included, but otherwise you would want to leave that out. Achievement and grade equivalent scores that are not current should not be included. Some boards do report educational data such as criterion reference assessments, DRAs and such. However, some boards don't want you to include that information. So again, the message being just know your board and what the common practice, what their policies and procedures are around that. And again, you would never report well, not that there's percentiles in those, but you wouldn't report the grade score. You would report some sort of descriptive range, as it would be more or less confusing if a parent were to pick up the IEP and have a look at that score. Okay, so keeping in mind here, so this is the areas of strengths and needs in the IEP. So keep in mind the description of a student's area of need should really make it evident why the student has the IEP or the special education program in place. The ministry in their document on page 59 provides a really nice example of students' strengths and needs. So you can have a look at that. I thought I would bring to light for you sort of a real life example. So here we have some strengths and some needs, which is based on this information here. So this here is from an IQ test from the WISC-5. It's a chart that you might find commonly presented in a PsychEd assessment. And from here, you're directly going to pull this information and include it in your students' strengths and needs. So verbal comprehension at the 8th percentile is certainly a weakness, so that gets listed under your needs. The student is strong in the visual area, so both visual spatial and fluid reasoning get mentioned as areas of strength. Working memory is strong, it gets put in as a strength, and processing speed gets put over into an area of need for that student. So looking really at the cognitive piece and connecting that cognitive piece to the IEP is really important, because that will drive the instruction in terms of strategies and assessment methods. It will also drive the instruction in terms of programming, like modifications and alt areas in the IEP. Down here, I've included just two excerpts from a PsychEd assessment, looking at various two different processing areas. So the two processing areas that we're looking at here are visual motor integration and memory. So you can see with this student, and I just did some highlighting here, the student has average visual motor and visual perceptual skills, which are put in here, and then a weakness with visual memory, or sorry, motor coordination skills, which we've included in the area of needs. And then similarly with the memory, we've pulled out the strengths and the weaknesses from that particular assessment tool. So in this ministry document, you can also find direction on the type of information to include in this section of the IEP, and like different places to source the information from, like from the OSR, whether or not to include information from a parent survey, and different assessment tools. And again, it's important to know the common practice in your board. For example, some boards include underneath strengths student interests such as sports or social justice, which is fine to do according to the ministry document. They say that it is okay to do that. However, some boards do and some boards don't. So you'll just need to make sure you know what the correct procedure is for your board and make sure you're following that. If you are including things such as student interests, you want to make sure that those are updated each time the IEP is updated, okay? Because those obviously change at a faster rate than some of the data. Okay, the next slide, we're going to look at accommodations. So accommodations do not alter the provincial curriculum expectations for the grade, but they simply describe the teaching and assessment strategies and supports that enable a student to learn and demonstrate their best learning. The aim of accommodations is to always individualize your accommodations based on a student's unique profile. So always ask, do the accommodations align with those needs and those strengths that you've listed in your IEP document and that you're pulling from the data? On this slide, I've included students' needs that we discussed in the previous slide. So the verbal reasoning and comprehension, the processing speed is a need, visual motor, and memory is a need. So, and then I've provided you with a list of instructional, environmental, and assessment strategies. And if we look, for example, at memory, so you want to keep, so the student struggles with memory for verbally presented information. So making sure that your instruction, oral instructions are kept short and simple, that you're giving a few instructions at a time, that you're repeating, re-auditorizing those instructions, or having the student repeat back to you so you can check their understanding. Making sure your environment is got lots of visual supports for anything that is requiring language to process. So lots of visual cues and anchor charts. And in terms of assessment, so making sure that you're not using a lot of time tests. You're checking for understanding of the big concepts rather than doing any kind of rote recall. And then really watching how you're doing your assessment and really chunking it into parts, and sort of be cautious of that culminating sort of bigger type of assessment, because that would be challenging for a student with memory difficulties. Okay, And the ministry guideline has some great resources in terms of a nice list of accommodations, and the page number that you can find that is listed there. A lot of IEP engines or programs that you're using will have a drop down or a data entry method. So usually they include both. So it gives you, lots of common accommodations, but then also gives you a chance to add your own that you can individualize based on your students' needs. And this is our last slide, which we're looking at a child's the teaching strategies and assessment methods that you would use for a modified program. So for example, here's just a list of strengths and needs. So this student has a strength in oral language, so speaking, strength in visual memory skills, figure ground skills. So that's sort of being able to see the whole picture from the parts. Problem solving skills and computer keyboarding skills. So these three here look like they could come directly from a psych ed. This may or may not be. It could have a bit more detail if it's from a psych ed, or maybe the student's just is he a great social problem solver or visual spatial problem solver. This looks like it's sort of an academic observation. Then in the areas of need for this student are reading, listening, writing, so that whole language piece. And then any information that's coming at them in an auditory or verbal method is challenging for this student, and then organizational skills. So if the student has a modified program, you will have the expectations for that particular strand listed here. So this teacher wants the student to learn 75 new sight vocabulary words. And the teaching strategy here is that they're pre-selecting the strategy. They're not having the student rely on their weak organizational skills and their needs in reading and writing to do those. So they're not having the students self-select, they're selecting. So that's providing a teaching strategy that would be appropriate for the student's strengths and needs. Perhaps the rest of the class is self-selecting their own vocabulary to learn and to, as a goal, as an expectation. So you would only include the teaching strategies and assessment methods that are completely different from what the rest of the class is doing. So that's why you don't see teaching strategies listed for expectation 2, 3, and 4, because the teacher's likely able to just have that student do what the rest of the class is doing. In terms of assessment methods, I like that the teacher is relying on the student's strength of oral speaking skills in terms of assessing their knowledge of the new vocabulary. And then the third expectation is sort of looking at developing comprehension, and it looks like the teacher's trying to do that through a multisensory approach, which again accommodates for that student's area of need and brings in the student's area of strength. So that's a nice strategy to use under the assessment methods. All right, and that is the conclusion of our presentation on the IEP and connecting that to the PsychEd assessment. Below, I've included my email, the phone number, and my extension at Trillium. You can follow me on Twitter. I've also included a link. We've got a lot of great webinars coming up, so please sign up and have a look at those. This will be sent to you in the audio and the slide deck, and so please feel free to share it amongst your colleagues. And I'm not sure if there's any questions, Wendy, or if we're able.
We've got a couple of questions, Shannon, for you, specifically with regards to the IEP. Okay. One question was, when you're entering assessment data in the IEP, why not include IQ scores?
Well, because sometimes you want to keep them limited to descriptive ranges. And the reason being the IEP and this quote that you see that we've got on the last page, the IEP is written for the teacher, it's written for the parent, it's written for the administrator and the student. It should bring to life the student's strengths and needs for all of these people. So you want to keep it user-friendly. And by using descriptive ranges, it can be a lot less confusing for parents. So, and it's the same as to why we don't want to use grade level score or like PPM benchmark scores if we're going to include educational data, because it doesn't always have a lot of meaning for parents. And by using descriptive ranges, we can make it more meaningful.
Okay, there are two other questions. One is with regards to the strengths and needs section of the IEP, is there a minimum or maximum number of strengths and needs that need to be included in this section?
I'd have to refer back to the ministry document to check that, but I would think that you don't want it to be an all exhaustive list. When I worked as a psych ed consultant, we would try to, you could make a list very long for each side. You want to capture the most important and the most relevant for the program that you're implementing for the student at that time. So I would say for needs, somewhere around 6, and then probably the same for strengths.
Yeah. And again, the purpose of the IEP, Shannon, isn't it, it's to inform instruction. So
That's
as
right.
we mentioned, it's make sure that the most relevant material is on there. Okay, we do have one more question for you. What is an auditory memory weakness?
Auditory memory weakness would be if information is presented to a child verbally, their ability to remember that information, they're having challenges to do so. So basically, on the memory test, they're looking at memory that's presented that's very concrete and familiar to a child. So they might tell a child a story and ask them to repeat back that story. And if it's a story, the child would have sort of a schema to base that on and experience. So they would be able to have hooks and things to pull, put information on that they're hearing and then pull it back from their memory stores. So often kids are better at remembering sort of concrete information. And then there's abstract memory. So it's like remembering maybe a list of instructions. And in testing, they'll sometimes give kids a list of words to remember. So it's being able to attend and learn and remember information that is coming at you verbally is essentially what auditory memory means. As opposed to visual memory, which would mean remembering information, both short and long term, that's presented visually.
That's great. I think that's all of the questions that we have, Shannon.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming today. I know it's busy days, and thank you for all the work that you do. And we hope you can come visit us again soon at another of our webinars. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye, everyone.